It's an Archaeo-Death interview with Professor Howard Williams and his guest.
Archaeodeathlings, welcome to an Archaeodeath interview with me and my very special guest, one of my TikTok mutuals and fellow creators. Alexandra, please introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners.
Hello, thank you, Professor Williams, for having me on your show. I loved your content for such a long time. I am Alexandra Chan. I am an archaeologist, an author, and an artist. And my specialty is on the archaeology of slavery in the early colonial north of the United States.
And I'm so excited to talk to you because we've been mutuals for a while, but I find it very difficult to find people who are doing archaeology, who have and working out their experiences. And TikTok shows you some content and not others. And it seems like a good moment because you just sort of hit a milestone in followers, and we've got a video that you had go viral, which we can talk about later maybe. But it's I've obviously been aware of your work for a while, and you know, it's just a topic that's not really deathly, but it doesn't have to be. But it touches on themes of memory and the descendant communities, which these kinds of historical archaeology topics so profoundly connect to. And so I thought this would be a good opportunity to for my audiences perhaps to get something different they haven't had before, but something that you know I teach a little bit about, but I don't really have that confidence to share myself. But you know, so I mean, how did you get into, maybe as a starting point, how did you get into archaeology? Why archaeology for you, Alexandra?
I like to say that I might have almost been born with a trowel in my hand. It really does feel like one of those, it has the heavy weight of prophecy or destiny about it for me. I can't remember a time I didn't want to be an archaeologist. It might be a result of the fact that my mother also wanted to be an archaeologist, but in the 50s and the early 60s, she was discouraged from doing that because it was not considered a viable career path for a woman. And she kind of hung up those dreams. But as a result, our house, when I was growing up, was filled to the rafters with, old atlases and books about ancient civilizations and great discoveries and early human origins. And I think that, she would go through those books with me and we'd flip through and talk and her look at the pictures, and her excitement and enthusiasm about it, I think, ignited my own. And then in the end, I grew up and became kind of the archaeologist for both of us.
That's a beautifully put way of articulating how small things can inspire one. It doesn't have to be. Yeah. I have students that write sort of their applications to university, and you read them, and it's like, and then I beheld the pyramids of Giza. No, very few do that actually. I must admit, but there's those big, profound, dramatic moments. But actually, it's just sitting with a parent, looking through a book,
right.
Local museums,
and being completely blown away by the idea that there were people who called this world home before we did.
Yes.
That really captured my imagination, and it kind of stuck with me all the way.
I have archaeologists that have admitted that they got into archaeology via fantasy and historical dramas or books and films and TV. But it was very much the real thing that got you first then.
Yes. And I don't know, you probably didn't have the same kind of toys and such over there on that side of the pond that were popular here in the 80s, 70s and 80s. But we had a toy called the Manchichi, which was a abstract kind of like monkey type plush doll. And I had a Manchichi. They were the rage in the early 80s. And, this was a time when kids my age knew all their dinosaurs. They were learning the dinosaurs. I knew all of the dinosaurs, but I also knew all of the early hominins. And I told people, the people would say, oh, let me see your monkey. I was like, it's not a monkey. That's an Australopithecus. And
Get it right. Yeah.
Right. Get it right. So for me, it was a straight shot from like preschool to grad school, really. I never deviated one way or the other. All the deviations for me came after that.
So I
Mhm.
mean, so what kind of archaeology? I mean, was it sort of the early stuff that really captured your interest first of all, or
Yeah.
was it how did your career how did your studies develop at the university?
I, of course, was um, taken by ancient civilizations, the First Nations, First Americans, and all of that. But once I got into the field and I started, studying it in university and going to field schools and stuff, working on these pre-contact sites, it's not that it wasn't interesting. It always is. I
Hmm.
still remember the first artifact I ever found was about a 3,000-year-old arrowhead, and it just there was an electric charge in that object. I picked it up and it was like the centuries just collapsed in on each other. And suddenly there was nothing separating me from the hand that had dropped it 3,000 years before. And that was an electric moment. So I want to give that part of my career its due. But over time, I found it really frustrating because you'd spend months and months in the field and you'd come up with a few stone chips on the riverbank and be expected to reconstruct an entire way of life and a society. And as a, with that kind of evidence, it's normal that most interpretations revolve around really mundane things like economy, and adaptation to the physical environment. And that while that's important, that's not the juice for me. I want to know about the human drama, the relationships, the ideas about the natural order of things, the daily taken for granted of ancient people. And these are the things that are much more difficult to get at on a prehistoric site. Although Ian Hodder is my hero in terms of reconstructing an entire beautifully reconstructing an ancient civilization from relatively, just from the material record. So anyway, what
Yes.
happened was that towards the end of my university career, there was a visiting professor who was a historical archaeologist, and that to me was just a revelation. She introduced me to this whole other subdiscipline of archaeology, which has the added benefit of using historical or written records.
Yes.
So in the United States, we call it historical archaeology. I think you guys call it medieval archaeology, or?
Well, different terms. I mean, we would,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, we now use historical archaeology
Oh, okay.
or post-medieval archaeology,
Right.
industrial
Right.
archaeology. So you'd have contemporary archaeology, industrial archaeology, post-medieval archaeology, medieval archaeology before it. But historical archaeology is used. I'm babbling. Is used as an umbrella term, and I teach the students that because it's such a outside of the this island. That's the established term. Yeah.
Well, it just opened things up beautifully. Like I just couldn't get over how much more was possible when you have multiple lines of evidence that can be brought to bear. So now no longer just dealing with the physical material record. You've got the artifacts and the ecofacts, of course.
Yes.
But now you've also got like often a built environment that's still standing that you can read, like a physical map of social relations in the past. And you've got the historical written record, which you read once for what the content actually is, but then you read again as an artifact in and of itself.
Yes.
And so artifact, ecofact, landscape, historical or documents, these differing lines of evidence bring such a richer, more complete and nuanced understanding of the past than any one of those lines could have brought you on their own. And they show, they shed light on, like lacunas in the evidence in one. The other pillar of evidence might shine light on that. And you're able to get into really weighty, meaty questions, about social life. It's really great.
That captures very much my feelings on the matter. Is while I have a healthy rivalry with my prehistoric archaeology colleagues, where they call what I do post-interesting (PI), and I say this, and I say it's pre-interesting is what you do, mate. It's like very childish corridor banter. That's as far as it goes before we
I
just
can
start swearing.
relate to that. I'm very much in your camp. I found it much more satisfying and gratifying to be able to approach the past with all of these additional lines of evidence. So rich.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I also, my rivalry was with my historian colleagues, who I, of course, say that they're just specialist archaeologists who don't know what they're doing. That really riles them up. But we have a laugh. How we laugh as But anyway, no. But it's true that we work across sources and disciplinary debates, and that is so fascinating because it gives you that fine grained detail as well as those big pictures those small things can also speak to. So, I mean, how did that develop then in terms of because you went through to doctoral research and finding a project to focus on, that led you into sort of quite recent and, quite, as you say, quite a tangible past in the sense of obviously it's material, but it's very immediate in its connection to the present, I suppose.
Right. Oh, absolutely. So my research was conducted on the last standing slave quarters in the North. I don't know how much knowledge to assume here, but
go for it.
For people who don't know, generally speaking, slavery is, I think, in popular depictions and in literature and movies and TV and all of that, American slavery is associated overwhelmingly with the South. To the extent that most people, Americans at least, and probably others too, don't even realize that there was slavery in the North. But indeed there was. It was a different kind. It was a very different economy up here than down there. We didn't have like the sprawling plantations of cotton and tobacco and indigo and rice. Up north, it's more of an urban environment and small farms. The slave holdings were much smaller. Often enslaved people were in the same house with the master or in the same business with their master. So whereas in the South, many slaves were, most of them were field hands. And in the North, you would find, butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers. There wasn't a job to be done that there wasn't an enslaved person to do it. So those are the ways that slavery was very different up here, but there is such a mythos around it that slavery in the North, yes, well, it existed, but it was more gentle. It was more kind, benign. Yes, they were part of the family. We were Puritans. Puritans have a strong patriarchal obligation to care for their people, and this was the company line that was towed for hundreds of years. And even as late as starting my research in the 90s and early 2000s, most of the histories that you could find on Northern slavery promulgated these myths of a gentler, kinder form of slavery in the North. And so I went into this project in a myth-busting frame of mind, right? Like I was only 19 years old, but I already knew. Like I didn't have the receipts yet, but I knew there was something very wrong with this narrative, and I was out to, tear it down and tell some truth to power. And so it just so happened that there's this historic house museum called the Royal House and Slave Quarters Museum outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and I was at Boston University as a first-year graduate student, and my archaeological ethics and law professor presented that house as like a case study of something. And I just went up to him after class and I said, I don't know who I need to talk to or what needs to happen, but I want to excavate that site. It was electrifying for me to find out that there was slavery in the North. Even I, who had a lot of interest in Black history, I was not naive or uninterested in these facts of American history, but even I hadn't been aware that there was slavery right in our backyards. And so eventually, the museum also was under new management, and they were eager to update their interpretations to the public away from the old, like, glorious white forefathers, shrine to the, the benevolent patriarch and and they wanted to take advantage of the fact that they had ostensibly the last standing slave quarters in the North, and archaeology was obviously going to have to be part of that, because these are the kind of people that are traditionally thought of as historically invisible, meaning that they aren't really portrayed much or represented much in the written record. And it's not that they don't have history, it's just that their histories are written in like stone and bone and layers of earth. So that is how that project got started.
Wow. And then, so your determination and enthusiasm and the timing of it all just came together, and you did a field work as an integral part of your graduate studies. Is that the right term, graduate studies? I always get confused.
Yes, 3 years of excavation there, and it was an incredibly rich site. It's the 18th century, so it was before municipal garbage collection, is what I say. You have 65,000 artifacts that we recovered from an 18th century way of life. We had about 4,000 plant and animal remains, and then we had many thousands of plant remains in the form of charcoal and seeds, phytoliths, pollen, that kind of thing. And as you say, one of the things that, in America, the 18th century is pretty old. In Europe, it's pretty new. But what was interesting was being immersed in the 18th century for the research. I began to see all of the seeds of modernity that are in there, all the things that we take for granted as 20th and 21st century Americans, especially around race and definitions of race and race relations and class and all of these things have their seeds in the 18th century. And it was very fascinating to see this process unfold.
And did this affect the heritage interpretation on site in the end? Did it?
Yes, it did. It was pretty great. First of all, it started getting federal grants. It could never get grants before. And now all of a sudden they're an important site and they're getting federal grants that allowed them to further interpret. So for example, they had one of the rooms in the house that we know from the probate inventory was sleeping quarters for enslaved people, had been turned into a 19th century Daughters of the American Revolution room where that local group would come and play cards once a month and kind of dress in their costumes. And
I'm just trying to do a non-grimace face. Okay, cool.
I know, and it was like all these like 19th century porcelain dolls everywhere, and these ladies would come in once a month and play cards and pretend they were in the American Revolutionary period, but all the while this particular room was actually a sleeping quarters for enslaved people. So one of the things that they did, the museum did, was with one of their grants, they turned that room back into a sleeping quarters for enslaved people. They also, based on the probate inventory, they put sleeping rolls and everything in the kitchen and all the places that you would find enslaved people in the house. There's that. And then, of course, the interpretations that we made on the landscape of the estate and the use of space around the estate is now incorporated into the docents' presentations. They have now school kids that come every year. Many school classroom groups come through. It's a totally different place now, and so I'm really proud of that, being part of that.
And of the things that were found, what were the some of the things that perhaps surprised you, or even if they were perhaps confirmed by other sites, what things perhaps or shocked changed the way we thought about those?
There's a bunch. One of the things that was interesting to me was looking at the landscape of the estate. I don't have a picture of it, but if you can picture a Georgian mansion and a 2-story slave quarters that's in an L, so that they form an L with a courtyard in the middle. And part of that landscape, I wanted to think about not only what did it, I didn't want to just recreate the landscape for present day visitors. I wanted to, push a little further and ask, what do these landscapes mean? Most human landscapes have layers of meaning, and there's, on the surface, there's like what someone wanted to say with their landscape. And then you look underneath and there's usually deeper messages that are kind of inadvertently being communicated as well. So you've got this, we're sitting at the heart of this meticulously planned and constructed landscape that was obviously designed and ordered by Isaac Royal. But as an archaeologist, I'm interested in finding out, addressing what the landscape might actually have meant to the people who inhabited it. So in other words, what's Isaac Royal trying to say with his landscape, and to whom is he addressing himself? On the other hand, what meanings could it have acquired for the people who were who experienced the landscape differently? So people who built it, the people who were imprisoned by it, right?
Yes, it's kind of a prison, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So there's a lot of neoclassical design elements. You've got coined corners and pedimented windows and these false columns, and it's all kind of cultural allusion back to the villas of ancient Rome. And so with the neoclassical elements, I argue that he's trying to create a cultural legitimacy and longevity for his own elite status that wasn't real, because he was the son of a carpenter. He was born in the wilds of Maine. Yes. So
it's all nouveau riche,
Oh, totally. He's a provincial parvenu. Okay. But he has like aspirations to be sort of a member of the landed gentry. In the absence of an aristocracy, the merchant class kind of tried to comport themselves here as landed gentry, and that's what they were trying to do. I came up with I think it's great, but I call it guilt by association, right? But guilt spelled Gilt. So
that's my level of punning. I love it.
Right?
I love it.
Guilt by
that's
association.
Much better than my level of punning, actually. I love
right.
Yeah.
So then once we started doing the archaeology, though, so on the surface, you've got the great house and the slave quarters that are built to complement each other architecturally. And on the surface, then you can say, well, it's kind of an incorporative landscape. Okay, it's no accident that Isaac Royal refers to his slaves in his correspondence as "quote unquote" my people. He never calls them slaves or servants. He calls them my people. Okay, so that's the patriarch.
But personal as well.
Right. And so I think that this landscape can be interpreted in part as a metaphor for the royals' views on master-slave relations on this estate. But also there's a proximity, which is a constant reminder of the tight control that many enslaved people in the North were subjected to. They weren't in a distant slave quarter, a mile distant. They were a stone's throw away. They were within eyesight of the master family at all times. And I think also it gave a kind of a refined face to slavery, for it to roll up into that courtyard and see the beautiful slave quarters, nice and neat as a pin. It sort of says something about, the legitimacy of the slave system itself. But once we started doing the archaeology, this is what was interesting, is we started seeing a profound difference in the use of space and the function of the landscape. So that like 80% of the artifacts that we found, 80% of 65,000, came from the side and backyards of the slave quarters, exactly the places that are least visible from the Royals' central post. So on the surface, you have these buildings that seem to show that they're trying to project an image of like an incorporation, like a large family under the protective umbrella of a benevolent patriarch. But in the ground, we're seeing stark divisions between the master's space and slave, clean and unclean, free and unfree, and ultimately white and black. Right. And that's something that's getting built right into the landscape itself. So that was really cool.
It's so disturbing, though, at the same time.
It is. It's insidious.
And Joe, from a British perspective, obviously, hardly free of those.
Right.
In as we're living in a post-colonial, post-imperial landscape in Britain too, but there's still many a denial and we have those plush houses where there weren't enslaved people, but the same. I'm not far away from houses of comparable design, and but still, the servants, the whole hierarchy is blotted out of the visitor experience so often. For the servants' quarters and the kitchens are shown, but and it was a hard life is said, and everyone nods, but there's so much nostalgia just literally saturating the presentation. You can't breathe for it. It's just so that you can't get away from it, and so I kind of, it's almost, it's so familiar, and but it's very different. I'm not trying to say it's exactly the same, but you have those denials.
Well, these are the things that are so important for public history, right? Like to call people's attention to these things. And what's interesting too is that these dirty areas that were, all of the garbage in the side and backyards of the slave quarters were also where we found all of the artifacts to do with leisure time activities and self-adornment and presentation, and even like folk religion and self-help, like healthcare. All of those things were of the enslaved were also in those areas. So again, we've got these two different contested. We've got I want to call it a contested space, right? The royals think it means a sign of their own superiority.
Yes.
But from the enslaved people's perspective, it's relief from constant surveillance. It's a place
because they are on display and almost to guests and visitors, are they? As well as being surveilled all the time by the.
Yes. So they would want to be in the backyard with all the garbage, because at least there they can relax with their own, play some games, tell some stories, smoke some pipes, have community, and not be at the master's beck and call all of the time. Another interesting find were some artifacts to do with magic and conjuration, which directly is in contradistinction to the mythos around Northern slavery, which is that, well, they were really just Black Yankees. They assimilated more quickly. There weren't as many of them. They lost their culture and language, and they were treated well. So they just became Black Yankees, which is clearly not the case. And also that Isaac Royal was commemorated on his tombstone as a kind master and a true friend. And so that was another question I had going into the project. What is a kind master? What does that mean? Can we talk about what's the evidence for being kind? And on the one hand, there's no written evidence of any physical or corporal punishment. On the other hand, everyone in slave narratives, everyone agrees that the threat of the whip was necessary to keep slavery running smoothly. Whether or not it was ever used, the threat of the whip, the threat of sale was always there. And so there was no corporal punishment, but they spared no expense on medical treatments. So if you know about medical treatments in the 18th century, where doctors were likely to, purge, puke, bleed, and poison you to death.
Happy days.
Which may not have been intended as a punishment, but certainly would have been received as such. And these people were force-fed mercury and all kinds of horrible things. And also, it didn't address the spiritual component of illness that many African belief systems had. So I described in the book what I concluded was a medically hostile atmosphere. And so within that context, and the context of there being plenty of sales too, they sold people left and right. Some people they let keep their family members with them, and some they didn't. And within that context, I think the artifacts of magic and conjuration take on new importance, right? Because it's a way for people to try to harness higher powers or spiritual forces to help them cope with and respond to the dangers and the challenges of being human property. So the question was, well, what use is magic and conjuration on the estate of a kind master? Well,
so the private and the personal and the spiritual are kind of avenues of resistance and in a sense, is that a fair characterization?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. And there's evidence of that in the naming practices of the estate, where through naming, I think I've seen patterns that show a confirmation of the importance of adult men in the family unit. Whereas if you go by the documentary record alone, adult men are universally recorded as individuals with no ties. You know, a slave family in that time and place was a woman and her children, period. And yet, if you look at the naming practices on the estate, there's enough there to suggest that they were reasserting the importance of their fathers and uncles and brothers to the children, because there are a lot of kids on the estate that had the names of adult male slaves also on the estate, and that was touching. And I think finally, maybe the other big surprise was that with the idea that Northern slaves must have had more freedom of movement, partly because of the economy, partly because this idea that they were just freer up in the North and in the South, I expected to see lots of evidence of exploitation of the natural environment, growing their own gardens, exploiting, hunting and fishing and all of these things that you actually do find in the South and the Caribbean. But there was zero evidence of it. None, just none. And that was surprising. And because there aren't any other Northern slavery sites that have been excavated, or should I say, excavated and interpreted and published yet enough to understand whether this site is idiosyncratic or a sign of a larger kind of a systemic difference. But
that's interesting.
It was. And it's like, well, what is that about? Is it because they had enough rations to begin with, or is it because they weren't so free to move around? They are, right?
Yeah. So they're more intimate, but maybe they don't have control to wander to get into those.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's really interesting. And can I just confirm, because my knowledge of this is very limited, I'm presuming that when you talk about the documentary records, the enslaved people we know them only by a passing reference to a name of a purchase or a sale, or if there's some kind of exceptional event in the press that will mention.
Sure.
Is that true? Is that
yes,
very little knowledge of their?
We had the documentary record that we had consisted of probate inventories at the deaths of Isaac Royal Sr. and his son.
Oh, of course, right. Yeah.
Then that's where enslaved people are listed by name and given their value. They're usually listed with the cattle and pigs and all of that. And then there's also an account book that Isaac Royal kept for many years, and you can read all of his accounts of like what he spent money on. Of course, there's lots of missing pages, which I think he was probably cooking the books in some way.
Interesting.
So, but that's where you find things like I paid the doctor this much to feed mercury to House Peter or whatever. So there was Peter and there was House Peter, or you paid the tailor for livery for his enslaved house servants and that kind of thing. And then you've got newspaper advertisements for sales, for, in one case, for a runaway, court documents. There's in Antigua, they started as sugar planters in Antigua, and then they moved north after a series of a brutal series of years down there that included a failed slave revolt and smallpox and drought and all kinds of things. But 2 or 3 of their own people down there had been implicated in this failed slave revolt. And so one of them was executed, 2 of them were exiled. There's a lot of, you can glean a lot more information than you think from this array of documents, but it is scant, and you have to really want to do it. You have to.
Yeah, and it just remind. I'm thinking of the audience maybe thinking, well, little things don't give you access to the people, but just to balance that, counter that. Well, actually, this is the way to when all we have are names. We don't get the story. The closest we're going to get to the story is surely through those things that you were digging up.
Well, I mean, some of the things. So this is like one of the. As a historical archaeologist, I'm frequently in urban or semi-urban environments with lots of foot traffic and curious passersby. And, we were working behind a fence, but frequently, I can't tell you how many times someone will be walking by and they'd lob a question over the fence like, hey, finding any bones? And the answer was often, yes, we are finding some bones. But another question they always ask is, finding any gold? And to which I would say, no, something better. And that would always make them stop. They'd be like, what? What's better than gold? And I would go over to the fence and talk to them about the fact that we don't dig for goodies, we dig for information, and information is priceless. So some of the most valuable, in my opinion, valuable finds from the site had to do with the personal lives of the enslaved, and that's to do with like craftsmanship, self-adornment, and presentation, healthcare, personal acts of spirituality. We found some handmade clay marbles that in the 18th century, I mean, they were handmade and they were fired probably in the hearth. And in the 18th century, that was a boys' game. And there were 15 kids on the estate at that time. And they were all, except for the 2 young girls who belonged to the royal family, they were all little black boys. So that was really touching. That brought a tear to my eye to find those marbles there and to imagine enslaved children. And another fun find was all of the clay tobacco pipes we found in the backyard of the slave quarters. And one of them in particular was really neat because it had been incised with the letter M on 3 places on the bowl. And in 300 years of habitation on that site, there is no person that lived there with a name that started with the letter M except one, and that was an enslaved woman named Myra, who was listed in the 1754 Massachusetts slave census. And so, I mean, I'm just gonna take it. I'm gonna say this pipe belonged to Myra, and it indicates that smoking was a leisure time activity enjoyed by women as well as men in the quarter. It indicates at least an aspiration towards literacy, or maybe an attempt to project a kind of literacy that would bring a certain kind of status. It also marks ownership, which is an act of resistance when you yourself are owned. So there's lots of ways that you can find like the little things can open windows onto big ideas and can bring people out of the shadows. And part of what I did in my book, Slavery in the Age of Reason, was, at the time, it was pretty experimental, but I didn't care. I used some fictional vignettes. I wrote some fictional vignettes to try to create understanding, not just knowledge. So, you know, it's one thing to throw data at people, but I felt like that was a real disservice to the people who had been silenced in life, to just show them in terms of charts and graphs and statistical, you know, patterns of artifact distribution. So I presented all the data, but then I also wove it into these short little, like, one-page vignettes to kind of show the reader how these artifacts, you know, would have been involved in the creation of personal identities for actual people by, you know, that we know by name that lived on the estate. I thought it was pretty effective.
Wow. And that is the way to bring these stories to people, isn't it? Because we are writing for a specialist audience, but also for a broader audience, whether, you know, they are within the academy or beyond. And I think that's so important. And you've, you know, already you've sort of given us a sort of window onto that world, but I think your book is going to, you know, be the way people can follow up on this, and we'll put a link in the description for them to follow up. And it's such an important study, and as I said, you must be proud of both the being able to share it in book format and see that impact on the heritage space itself. That combined sort of connection is something I must admit my career I've never achieved properly in a way that I feel happy about. So I won't rant about my experience of coming to the heritage interpretation panels newly put up on the site I dug a few years earlier, and the expletives that left my mouth in front of my students as I went, what, you know, and then I went, I'm just going to walk into the middle of the field for a few minutes and scream, it's fine, I'll be back. And then you know, so I'm both, you know, intellectually envious, not in a, you know, real way, but, you know, I'm just really, I appreciate and recognize how much of a, you know, that means to have that. And
Yes.
And so I mean, there's almost another probably couple of conversations we could have about that site and about the rest of you're an ongoing author and everything. But I wondered if you'd at least capture a little bit of that for us here. Maybe that's for another conversation. But you've just produced another book on you know, a more personal tale. But I wonder if you'd sort of is it possible to connect that to this? I don't know. How would you...
There is. In fact, I mean, I'll just hold them up here.
Yay!
This is Slavery in the Age of Reason, Archaeology at a New England Farm. And that's on the 3 years of excavation at the Isaac Royal House and slave quarters. And then this is my new book, In the Garden Behind the Moon, a memoir of lost myth and magic. And in fact, I did bring a lot of my archaeological skill set and methods to the writing of this very personal memoir, partly because it's really about, you know, every time I wrote an archaeological report, we excavated like a 19th century farmstead and we had to write a report about it. You know, what did we end up doing? We would sift through artifacts and documents and dates and stories and histories to create a compelling narrative that would bring these people that lived at the site to life. And that's what I found myself doing. I'm taking all these disparate sources from my own family and ancestors and elders and weaving them into a compelling tale and sifting. I mean, there really was a sense of sifting through old stories and artifacts of their lives and tying it then to a much larger moment that speaks to everyone, and I think that people will find both of these books to be incredibly timely and current even today. This one in particular was my earnest offering to the collective in this chaotic, dark, and uncertain time that we all find ourselves in. Very explicitly was my offering to the collective. So based on this idea that the stories we tell end up becoming the life that we live. And so are we telling the right stories? Are we telling them well? And archaeology is all about telling stories, right? Finding the stories and telling the right ones. And if you aren't telling the right stories, I mean, we're a storytelling animal. And if we aren't able to tell stories, we've forgotten how, or we're caught telling the wrong ones, there's almost unlimited damage that can take place, right? So it's really about restoring ourselves back to good, healthy storytellers. And good, healthy story is what I define as something that's rooted in love for self, love for other. A good story creates connection. It creates a bridge and understanding. An unhealthy, and it will never cause harm. So if a story is causing harm, it's not a good story, and it's probably a false story. So that's how.
And people don't know necessarily that they're listening to something that's false or harmful until the repercussions have already happened or are unfolding, and that's, I think, what we see with a lot of our national histories, both sides of the pond, as to put it that way, and it takes a long time to get people to even face up to them and to to challenge them. And I as someone who tries to, I don't frame it as storytelling as much as I know it's one of those things it's not my strength. I'm long thought about this, but I think people receive bits of stories or fragments of stories in different ways, and I think that whether I'm going to a site or I'm talking about some actual research, I think we're all at different ways of telling stories, but I think we do have to make sure that we're telling the right ones and we're not perpetuating, without critical attention, things that are going to have a real impact and in a bad way. I mean, so I think it sounds like your new book is obviously the personal weight of responsibility to represent your own family, but also a broader collective, as you say, because it's about how we all try to do that.
Hopefully, in the course of reading that book, the reader will experience a reawakening of their own inner storyteller, their own inner artist. If all of life is a work of art, we must endeavor to remain the artist. I don't know who said that. Probably a lot of creative people have said that in one way or another. But I think that it's an invitation to readers to rediscover that inside themselves.
So you think the past in today's world is still cannot be made, it can't be taken away from us, no matter how much people.
Past is never past, right? The past is present, and we see it all the time. I mean, in some right now, in particularly brutal and alarming ways. Like we're always running headlong into our own past, especially Americans. I mean, we've had a really hard time transcending our past. We really have never reckoned nationally with our past. And even after the Civil War, the Confederacy, there was no national reckoning. The Confederacy was simply reabsorbed into the Union, and where it festered. And that's why we ended up with the Ku Klux Klan and the lynchings and the Jim Crow laws and the civil rights struggle of the 60s. And then, after Barack, we thought we had transcended it for a little while. We were, naively happy when Barack Obama was elected president. But then, there's a certain sector of our society that went into a serious death spiral after that. And everything of the last, 10, 12 years has been, I think, a backlash against the possibility that a Black man could ever be in charge. Some Americans just can't face it.
And so much of what happens in America gets directly and indirectly bounced around Europe, including Britain, and around the world. And so we're experiencing our own versions of these reverberations. It doesn't quite manifest itself in the same way, in the same severity, but it's really difficult to, teaching young people, on a daily or at least weekly basis. It's difficult to. They're very core. They won't divulge their views on many issues, political or cultural, and but I'm trying to sort of teach, to try and get them to, prod them to think about this without being too sort of in their face, but try to sort of say,
Right.
it's like teaching sensitive subjects like this one is really difficult to undergraduate students who, they're not from the US, they may not understand that Britain's role in these processes, and trying to just gently but very systematically in a lecture try and take them through some of the examples. And you can see some of them just looking utterly like, well, we didn't do this at school. They know, the school is good and they learn a lot about history, but not the archaeology. And so it's really challenging to keep going at these times when so much pressure's on us to just look the other way or just skip over it. And I don't know, it's, who knows where things are going, but at least we seem to share that the importance of the subject, which is under attack in different ways.
Right.
I don't know if there will be, like, I've seen art departments close in universities, and but I think we just have to try and keep from reminding people of the importance of the subject that can tell so much about the past that other subjects can't, or we have a role here. We have a responsibility here. I don't know. I'm getting all ranty now.
No, but I totally agree. It's important. We can't really be neutral, I don't think, when it comes to certain topics.
And that's, I suppose, takes us to, may I dare to sort of, I don't want to, there's so many topics we could just go on about. I'd love to just take your temperature on, because you've been a creator on TikTok for, I don't know, when I found you.
Yeah, I've been on it for like a year.
Right. I thought you were here longer than that, actually, but that shows my weird timescales have gone. For me, you've in my mind, you've been a constant presence for the last 5 years, but obviously not. But it shows just how my brain doesn't work anymore in terms of time. But I certainly appreciate seeing your videos. But you touched a nerve recently with a reflection. I'd wonder if you'd be willing to share that and how that you think might affect your onward journey as a creator on social media. Because what you're doing is addressing that very point you said.
Right. Well, what happened was the Kendrick Lamar halftime show for the Super Bowl took place.
Oh, yes.
And in the wake of that, there were two camps, those who loved it and those who hated it. So while I was watching it, though, I had a very interesting, and it's so funny because I almost didn't post that video. I really came so close to not posting it because I felt like it was too esoteric and nerdy and just kind of like my history nerd loving self. I thought it was cool, but nobody else would be interested. But in the end, I was like, I'm just going to put it out there. This is what I saw. And it reminded me of a piece of research that I had stumbled across in the Isaac Royal project. And that is, while they were still living in Antigua, I referred earlier briefly to this foiled slave revolt, an island-wide plot to kill every white person, man, woman, and child on the island. And it was set to take place that very night, but somebody ratted, and it got discovered. And there was a huge inquisition. Scores of people were executed. Others were, tortured and executed. And then others were exiled, and it was just a terrible, terrible tragedy. That's just a terrible thing. But in the investigations into that foiled plot, they discovered that from witnesses that they had voted one of their own to be king. They would meet in the forest. This is something that would not have happened in New England. In the Caribbean, where it's 85-90% Black, you could go, hang out in the forest with your people and, have a whole other kind of community there. And they voted this man named Court to be their king. And most of these people were Akan speakers. So from the Gold Coast, which is now mostly modern day Ghana. And King Court also appointed generals, so to speak, and they agreed to, they conceived of a plan to set themselves free on an island-wide basis. And the day of the insurrection, King Court and his generals and underlings went into the public square and performed an Ikem dance, I-K-E-M, an Ikem dance, which was for the Akan-speaking peoples a public declaration of war because they believed that enemies deserved fair warning before an attack. But what happened was that all of the white people on the island saw this dance in the public square, and they thought it was a pageant, like an entertainment that was put on by slaves for the enjoyment of white people or for each other. They did not understand what they were seeing. They did not perceive the threat. And that is how King Court communicated to all of the island's enslaved people that today is the day, it's on, get ready. And so I compared Kendrick Lamar's halftime show to a modern day equivalent of an Ikem dance because I thought that the songs that he chose, the lyrics that were in those songs, things like turn off the TV, things like mustard, that's a very kind of military, you muster your people together, ready. It was, to me, a modern day equivalent of an Ikem dance and a public declaration, if not of war, then of total defiance to what's happening right now in the United States. A call to arms, metaphorically speaking, for all the people in the resistance, and most particularly Black people, and a statement of solidarity and a call to arms. And for whatever reason, that really resonated with people. It gave them hope. I think a lot of Americans have been, I can speak for myself, have been feeling, horrified, terrified, almost paralyzed with fear about what's going on right now. Yeah. Helpless, like no, there's no leadership from, our side of things. Like our Democratic leaders have been in hiding, it seems. We feel left to the wolves, like there's nobody out there to help us. But to have a leader like a cultural leader like Kendrick Lamar on an enormous stage and in front of the president himself, and to come out and say all of those things was incredibly fortifying. And I think it resonated with a lot of people as a result. And they were just fascinated by the historical connections. And I don't say that Kendrick Lamar knows anything about an Ikem dance or any of that, although I do think he does have ancestry from Ghana. I'm pretty sure he does. But it doesn't really matter because the point is that it's a parallel. It's a historical, it's an equivalent. What he did served the same purpose as the Ikem dance served in Antigua in 1736. And that was a really neat historical connection for me. And I was just very excited to see so many people agreed.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I can't claim I knew all the songs and knew all how it were connected together. And I don't think I've seen so many different responses and reactions showing that people across communities in the US don't seem to have the same view. I saw people saying, well, he doesn't understand the Gil Scott-Heron song. It's about not being televised. So I thought that was kind of the point. I thought that was the point. Yeah. It's kind of resistance and rage with a smile and a strut. That's the point. Yep. I thought that's what I'd got to, and then you sort of took it to a couple of stages further than my thinking had got to. Mm-hmm. And I don't. So, but then I've seen people who just go, even who are sympathetic with his message, saying, "Oh, it's a sellout. You don't think he knows what he's doing." And I don't know his music that well, but I just thought I understood. I understood where this was going, mm-hmm. And I thought that was reasonably clear from the opening through. But I hadn't thought about the historical parallels, and I thought that was so important. As you say, it's not about saying, he's definitely done this. The author has clearly done this, and this. It's not about that. It's about the conversation and how it's resonating with people. And I thought what you had to say was really important in that regard. And I'm pleased that people it's a good example of how, for me, when you have that education, you can make the connections and bring a story from the past to an event in the present, and it chimes with people and gets people talking, even if they're disagreeing with you. They're
Right.
thinking it through for themselves.
Right.
And I thought that was
Right.
so.
And
Yeah,
that's a sign of a good story, right? A good, healthy story. It makes people feel less alone in the world to have like that. I think that's one of the main purposes of story, is that it allows us to see our own circumstances in from a wider context, from a higher perspective. And then we find either in history or in myth and legend, it doesn't really matter. We find companionship in our fears and our anxieties, our brokenness. Nothing is new. You know, it's all, the labyrinth is known. The labyrinth of earthly life is known. And that's what stories let us know. And so that's why they end up being important.
Well, there's so much more we could delve into, but perhaps we should wrap up the formal part of the interview there. And I've just been absolutely a joy talking to you, and I really do respect and appreciate the trust you put in me to sort of have this conversation, given the topics are so sensitive, and as you say, they're still live. You know, they're still raw for people in your nation and also just around the world. But I think that's all the more reason why we should try and do these things and try to sort of share these perspectives. But you know, as I
really enjoyed this. This was fun. Thank you.
Thank you. And I, obviously, again, I'll repeat that we'll put the links in the description to your work so people can follow up on that. And just Alexandra, I look forward to seeing what comes next with your social media and your journey through, and I hope we chat further in the future.
Yeah, thank you. I do too. One thing I will say is that I got like 30% increase in followers from that video, which I think gave me a little more, felt like I had a little more permission to speak more explicitly about current events and political leanings and all of that, because my goodness, if 30% of my followers came to me because of my Kendrick Lamar take, then I guess I'm allowed to say what I really think. So.
Well, exactly. It's confidence builder, and it shows there is an audience. And I wish you all the best with whatever next video you come out with that goes viral, because it's such a lottery and we can never quite tell. But you know, it's going to happen.
Yeah. Thank God I mentioned both of my books in that video. That's all I have to say.
That's always the way.
All right.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Follow ArchaeoDeath on YouTube, TikTok, WordPress, and a host of other social media.